Silence is never just silence. It carries weight. It carries history. It carries the echoes of words never spoken in Stephen King's The Shining. Silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something darker, an unspoken grief, a buried rage, a whisper of violence waiting to become thunder. Jack Torrance does not become a monster overnight. He is sculpted slowly, shaped by silence that festers in the dark corners of his mind. Silence between him and his wife. Silence between him and his son. Silence between him and the world that has already judged him. The hotel, with all its corridors and locked rooms, becomes nothing more than an extension of that silence. Walls that do not echo laughter but devour it. A space where words vanish, and in their absence, madness begins to speak. When we talk about fathers who turn into monsters, we often imagine the dramatic, the man who raises his hand in violence, the man whose voice shatters glass, the man who strikes fear with his presence. But what King forces us to face is subtler, more insidious. The father who retreats into silence until it is no longer retreat, but surrender. The man who buries himself in his failures and leaves his family to live among his ghosts. Jack Torrance was once a teacher, once a writer, once a man with promise. But silence came creeping in the moment he could no longer face the weight of expectation. Instead of words, he drank. Instead of healing, he punished. Instead of confessing weakness, he allowed his weakness to eat him alive. And so, little by little, Jack's silence devoured him until he was hollow enough for the Overlook Hotel to claim as its own. Fear, in The Shining, is not simply the supernatural. The hotel is terrifying, yes, but it only works because Jack carries fear inside him long before he walks its haunted halls. The fear of failure, the fear of insignificance, the fear of being seen as weak in the eyes of his family. Many fathers carry this weight. Though most will never admit it, they wear silence like armor, convincing themselves that quiet means strength. They mistake the suppression of emotion for discipline. But what silence truly creates is distance. And distance in a family can be deadlier than any ghost. Danny, the son, does not fear the hotel first. He fears his father's unpredictable silences, the empty spaces between the moments of warmth, the unpredictable shifts when Jack's face hardens and his words vanish into clenched teeth. For a child, silence is often the first monster they meet at home. It is important to understand that silence is not neutral. Silence communicates. A slammed door that follows silence speaks of resentment. A father staring into a bottle while saying nothing tells his child that love is conditional. That presence does not mean protection. Jack's silence teaches Danny and Wendy that they must walk carefully. That affection is fragile, that any wrong word could awaken something terrible. This is how silence becomes fear's accomplice. The Overlook Hotel whispers promises of greatness to Jack, but it is his silence that gives those whispers a throne to sit upon. Without silence, there would be resistance. Without silence, there might be confession, healing, even redemption. But silence devours the chance for change, replacing it with inevitability. King once wrote, "Monsters are real, and ghosts are real too. They live inside us, and sometimes they win." Jack Torrance is proof of that truth. The real monster is not the hotel. It is Jack's inability to face himself. It is his refusal to break the silence around his failures, his guilt for hurting his son, his dependence on alcohol, his rage at a world that has denied him success. Every father who becomes a monster begins with that same silence, a refusal to admit he is drowning. And when silence wins, those who love him suffer the consequences. It is not always physical blows, it can be emotional neglect, icy distance, the erosion of a child's innocence under the weight of unspoken tension. Silence kills slowly, but its victims bleed all the same. We must ask ourselves, why do men choose silence? Why do fathers, who are supposed to be protectors, retreat into caves of their own bitterness rather than opening their mouths to ask for help? Part of it is pride. Society tells men that to admit weakness is to surrender masculinity. A man is supposed to be the pillar, unshaken, unbroken. But the truth is, silence breaks them faster than confession ever could. Another part of it is shame. To speak of failure is to make it real. And so men swallow it, hoping no one notices the cracks. Yet families notice, children notice, wives notice. Silence does not erase failure, it broadcasts it, and still. Many fathers let it grow, until silence itself is louder than any cry for help. Jack's story is not unique. It is an allegory for a disease that spreads quietly across countless households. A man loses his job and tells no one of the despair it causes him. A father makes a mistake and chooses silence rather than apology. A husband feels resentment, but lets it rot in his chest rather than laying it bare in vulnerability. These silences accumulate, layering upon one another, until the family lives in a home heavy with ghosts no one can see. And when silence has devoured long enough, it no longer needs words. It manifests in actions, a sudden slap, a slammed fist, a drunken rage, a monstrous transformation that shocks the family. Though in truth, it has been coming for years. The genius of The Shining is that King does not let us hide behind the excuse of the supernatural. The hotel is merely a catalyst, a magnifying glass placed over Jack's inner demons. The silence that devours is his own. It is the silence between him and his wife after an argument. The silence after he hurt his son's arm in a drunken outburst. The silence after he failed to write, after he lost his teaching job, after he saw himself as less than what he wanted to be. Each silence is a brick in the wall that separates him from humanity, until the only voice he can hear is the one that whispers from the dark. And when a man listens only to silence, the monster within is given permission to speak. So what can we learn from this? Perhaps the most terrifying truth: silence is not passive, it is active destruction. It devours trust, it devours intimacy, it devours the chance for redemption, and for children, it devours safety. Danny shines, yes, but his real gift is not just supernatural. His real gift is seeing through silence, recognizing the emotions that others will not speak. He knows the silence around his father is dangerous long before the walls of the Overlook begin to bleed. That is the tragedy. Children often know when silence has become poison, even before the adults are willing to admit it. And now, we must ask ourselves, how many families live within their own Overlook hotels? How many fathers retreat into silence instead of speaking their fear? How many children are raised in houses where the walls are heavy with unspoken resentment? We may not have haunted hallways, but we have haunted dinner tables, haunted bedrooms, haunted living rooms where silence reigns like a tyrant. Jack Torrance is not only a character in a novel, he is a mirror. And the silence that devours is not bound to fiction. It lives in our world too. And it waits for the moment when fathers, men, human beings surrender their words and allow their ghosts to speak louder than their hearts. But silence is not always born from cruelty. Sometimes it grows from desperation. Jack Torrance is not simply a violent man. He is a man who wanted to be better and failed. He dreamed of writing the great novel, dreamed of sobriety, dreamed of being the father Danny could admire, and yet each failure pushed him further into himself. And each silence became a punishment he inflicted not just on his family, but on himself. This is the cruelty of silence. It does not only devour relationships, it devours identity. When a father cannot speak his grief, his disappointment, his shame, he loses the language of who he is. Jack becomes less Jack, less human, more hollow, until the hotel can fill him with its whispers. Silence is not empty. It is fertile ground where madness can root itself and grow unchecked. Wendy, trapped in this silence, is forced into a role she never asked for, the interpreter of absence. She learns to read Jack's silence the way sailors read the sky before a storm. Is he quiet because he is brooding, or because he is about to erupt? Is he silent because he is ashamed, or because he no longer cares? Living with silence means living with uncertainty, and uncertainty is its own kind of terror. For Wendy, the silence is worse than the shouting. Shouting can be confronted. Silence is a shifting void. She cannot protect Danny from what she cannot define, and that helplessness is what makes the silence so unbearable. In this way, silence is the perfect weapon for abuse. It keeps the victim guessing, hoping, waiting, until hope itself begins to rot. The hotel feeds on Jack not just because he is weak, but because he is silent. Words are weapons against the dark. Words connect us, anchor us, remind us of who we are. But silence breaks those chains. The longer Jack stays quiet, the more his identity disintegrates, and the more the hotel can mold him into the monster it needs. Imagine if Jack had confessed, aloud, his fears of inadequacy. Imagine if he had spoken to Wendy about his guilt for hurting Danny. Imagine if he had said, "I am scared. I am broken. I need help." Those words could have changed the story. But silence offers no such redemption. Silence is absolute. It allows no interruptions, no pleas, no forgiveness. And so the devouring continues until there is nothing left but rage. It is easy, perhaps, to condemn Jack and call him evil, to dismiss him as a man who simply gave in to his darker instincts. But that is too simple, too clean, too comforting. The truth King offers us is far messier. Jack is not uniquely monstrous. He is an ordinary man crushed beneath extraordinary pressure. He is a father with dreams, a husband with regrets, a worker discarded by a system that only values productivity. He is what happens when a man is told to be strong, but not told how to heal. The Overlook Hotel is the stage, but the tragedy is universal. For every Jack Torrance in fiction, there are countless silent fathers in reality, retreating into themselves until silence becomes violence. And this should frighten us more than any ghost, the ordinariness of the monster. Fear thrives in silence. When we do not speak of abuse, abuse grows. When we do not speak of mental illness, it festers. When we do not speak of loneliness, isolation deepens. Jack Torrance is a cautionary tale of what happens when silence becomes the dominant language of a household. The father grows bitter, the mother grows anxious, the child grows frightened. And eventually, something breaks. Sometimes it is the family bond. Sometimes it is the mind. Sometimes it is the body. But something always breaks because silence demands sacrifice, and the family pays the price. Consider Danny, the child caught in the storm. His gift, his shining, allows him to sense the horrors of the hotel, but it also makes him painfully aware of the silence that surrounds his father. For Danny, silence is never just silence. It is a signal, a warning, a shadow creeping closer. He knows that words could save his father, but he also knows his father will never speak them. For a child, this realization is devastating. The understanding that love is not always enough to heal what is broken, that silence can be stronger than affection. And so Danny shines, not because it is extraordinary, but because it is survival. He must see what others cannot in order to live. How many children, we might ask, grow up shining in their own way, reading silence, predicting moods, walking on eggshells, not because they want to, but because they must? Silence, then, is inheritance. It passes from father to child like a curse. Jack was raised in violence, a child of silence himself, and he never escaped it. He carried it into his marriage, into his fatherhood, into the walls of the hotel. He believed he was different, that he could fight the ghosts of his past. But silence ensured he never would. And Danny, too, is marked by it. He may survive, but the memory of silence will always haunt him. This is how cycles of trauma persist, not always through fists, not always through words, but through silence that teaches children fear before they can even speak. A father becomes a monster not when he shouts, not when he rages, but when his silence tells his family they are alone even when he is in the room. So let us ask, where does silence live in our own lives? How many conversations have we avoided because the truth was too heavy? How many apologies have we swallowed, thinking time would heal what silence only deepened? How many children sit tonight in their bedrooms, hearing not the comfort of a parent's voice, but the silence of a closed door? King's brilliance is that he turns the supernatural into metaphor, but the metaphor is sharper than the ghost. The real haunted house is not the Overlook. It is the home where silence has become the loudest voice. And the real horror is not the axe in Jack's hand, but the silence in his heart that put it there. Perhaps the most chilling truth is that silence does not need intention to destroy. Jack did not set out to become a monster. He set out to be a father, a writer, a man redeemed. But silence eroded every path forward, until the only road left was rage. This is what we must remember. Monsters are not born in dramatic acts. They are born in the quiet moments when words are withheld, when confessions are buried, when pride is chosen over connection. The silence that devours is patient. It does not need to rush. It waits, and it feeds, and it grows, until even love is no longer strong enough to resist. And when silence finally erupts, it does not do so as speech. It becomes violence. It becomes the slam of an axe against a door, the breath of a man who is no longer a father, but a beast pacing in the dark. This is the culmination of all those years of swallowed words, of guilt left unspoken, of apologies never uttered. Silence transforms itself into action, but not the kind of action that heals. It is the kind that wounds beyond repair. Jack's rage in the Overlook is not sudden. It is the harvest of seeds planted long before. Every unspoken fear, every unexpressed need, every avoided conversation. This is what swings the axe, not just Jack's hand. This is why silence is so terrifying. It may appear still, but it is never still. It is always moving, always turning, always sharpening the blade. Wendy's screams, Danny's desperate flight. These are the counterpoint to Jack's silence. They are the sound of survival, the raw defiance of those who refuse to be devoured. And yet even their voices are haunted by silence. For what do you scream when the man you love is no longer there? What do you cry when the father you trusted is gone, replaced by something you do not recognize? Their screams echo. But Jack's silence lingers heavier, because silence does not end when the noise begins. Even as the chase rips through the hotel's corridors, the silence between who Jack was and who he has become suffocates them all. They are not only running from a man with an axe, they are running from the absence of the man he should have been. This is the psychology of making a mistake. One mistake, one silence, may not ruin a man, but mistakes accumulate. They layer like dust, and silence cements them into stone. Jack's story is not about a single error. It is about a life built on denial, about failing to confront the darkness within. When he hurt Danny's arm, that was a mistake. When he lost his teaching job, that was a mistake. But it was silence, his refusal to confront, confess, apologize, that turned mistakes into inevitability. This is where criminal psychology enters, because crime is often not about the moment itself, but the buildup, the erosion of conscience, the silencing of the voice that says, stop. Silence kills the inner dialogue that could have prevented the act, and so, what begins as a mistake ends as tragedy in this way. The Shining becomes more than horror. It becomes a study of human morality under pressure. What do we do when the silence inside us grows louder than the voices of those who love us? Do we face it, or do we let it consume us? Jack chooses consumption. He lets silence devour his compassion, his responsibility, his identity, and once silence takes enough, morality collapses. The man who once cradled his child now raises a weapon against him. The man who once swore to protect his wife now hunts her through hallways. This is the outcome of silence unchecked. Morality becomes malleable, twisted into justification for cruelty. Jack tells himself he must correct his family. He believes the silence is truth, when in fact it is madness speaking in his voice. And yet, the story is not only about destruction, it is also about resistance. Danny, small and fragile, resists not with strength, but with awareness. He knows silence, knows it too well, but he does not surrender to it. He shines, he speaks, even if silently, through his visions, through his bond with Halloran, through his refusal to let silence dictate his survival. This is the quiet triumph in King's Tale, that even when silence devours, there are still voices that can pierce through. Children often become those voices. They notice, they resist. They carry the light into places where silence has made everything dark, but the cost is heavy. Because no child should have to survive silence. No child should be forced to shine in order to live. The lesson is cruel but undeniable. Silence is a choice, even when it feels like surrender. Fathers who become monsters do not wake one day transformed. They silence themselves day after day until transformation is the only outcome left. But silence can also be broken. Words, even painful ones, can rebuild bridges that silence has burned. An apology can undo years of quiet cruelty. A confession can drain the poison silence has allowed to spread. Vulnerability can disarm the monster before it rises. Yet too many men, too many fathers, cling to silence because they mistake it for control. They believe their families are safer if they say nothing. They do not see that silence itself is the threat. We leave The Shining with images of snow, of a boy running through a frozen maze, of a man lost in his own monstrous silence. But the story does not end there, not truly. It lingers in every family where silence reigns. It asks us to question ourselves, not just Jack. Where in our lives has silence grown too strong? What words have we withheld that could have saved love, trust, connection? What mistakes have we allowed silence to transform into scars? And most of all, what monsters are we feeding when we refuse to speak? The silence that devours does not live only in the Overlook Hotel. It lives in us. And so, the question is not just why Jack became a monster, but whether we will too. There is a strange irony in silence. It often begins as protection. Jack thought silence would shield him from shame. He thought if he buried his failures deep enough, they would lose their power. But silence never erases, it preserves. It keeps every wound fresh, every regret sharp, every fear alive. It is like placing a corpse in a sealed room. The body may be hidden, but decay seeps through the walls until the entire house reeks of it. This is what Wendy and Danny lived inside, the invisible stench of Jack's unspoken despair. And because he would not name it, they could never fight it. Silence turns pain into something untouchable, unreachable, immortal. The hotel did not create Jack's ghosts. Silence made them eternal. The silence of fathers echoes louder than any words because children mistake it for truth. Danny, in his innocence, wonders if the silence means he is the problem. Many children do. When a parent retreats into silence, a child rarely thinks something is wrong with them. Instead, they whisper to themselves, "Something is wrong with me." This is the cruelty of silence in a family. It does not stay with the one who keeps it. It spills over, teaching the innocent to carry guilt that never belonged to them. How many adults walk the world today, haunted not by what their parents said, but by what they never said? Silence is inheritance, and it takes root deeper than words ever could. Yet silence has another face, one that is perhaps even darker, the silence of society. Jack's decline is not only personal, it is also systemic. He is a man who lost his job, who lost his sense of worth, who reached for alcohol because the world offered no softer place to fall. Men are taught that to ask for help is weakness. Families are taught to keep struggles hidden. Communities look away until it is too late, and so silence is reinforced, generation after generation, until breaking it feels like heresy. Jack's silence is not just his. It is the silence of a culture that refuses to admit that fathers are fragile. 2. And when society silences men, homes become Overlook Hotels long before the walls begin to bleed. Consider the pressure of masculinity as a cage. Fathers are told, be strong, provide, endure, do not cry, do not confess, do not falter. And so silence becomes their only outlet, but a cage, no matter how well built, does not prevent escape. It ensures destruction when the prisoner finally breaks free. Jack broke, and the hotel was waiting. But how many men break every day in smaller, quieter ways? How many children watch their fathers turn cold, withdrawn, unreachable? How many wives sleep next to men whose silence is heavier than their presence? These are the real hauntings. These are the real monsters, not the ghosts in the hotel, but the ghosts in our homes. Born from silence, we refuse to confront. King understood this when he wrote The Shining. He gave us a supernatural story, but beneath it lies a social commentary sharper than any blade. He forces us to ask, how many Jacks are among us? How many men walk with bottled rage because silence has eaten their language of love? How many children like Danny live with a gift of sensitivity, not because they want it, but because silence has forced them to become interpreters of pain? And how many Wendy's survive, not because they are fearless, but because they have learned to live with silence so long it has become a second skin? The hotel is fiction. The silence is not. Breaking silence, then, is an act of rebellion. It is an act of survival. To speak when silence demands obedience is to say, I will not let the monster grow. It is to refuse inheritance, to refuse despair, to refuse the overlook that society builds within our homes. But breaking silence is also terrifying. It strips away the armor of pride. It exposes the vulnerability men are taught to bury. It risks rejection, judgment, even collapse. And yet, without that risk, the outcome is certain. Silence will devour, and what it devours cannot easily be rebuilt. Danny's survival is symbolic of this truth. He does not stay silent. He reaches out, first through his visions, then to Halloran, finally through the strength to confront what his father has become. His voice saves him. His voice disrupts the silence. He teaches us that children, though small, often hold the courage adults cannot muster, and that should shame us. It should remind us that the responsibility to break silence should never fall on the child. It belongs to the parent, to the adult, to the father who must decide whether to be human or to be hollow. And so, the silence that devours leaves us with a choice. We can cling to it, feed it, let it grow until it makes monsters of us. Or we can break it, speak, confess, apologize, admit fear, admit weakness, admit that being a father, being a man, being human, is not about silence, but about connection. Words may be imperfect, but silence is poison. Words may stumble, but silence suffocates. Words may hurt, but silence kills. Jack Torrance is a warning, but he is also a mirror. We may look at him and see a monster, but if we look long enough, we may also see ourselves. And now, the question that lingers like the echo of footsteps in an empty hall. Where in your life has silence devoured too much already? What words are rotting inside you, waiting to be spoken? And if you do not speak them, who will pay the price? There is a corridor in every human heart that resembles the Overlook, long, dim, lined with doors we do not dare open. Behind each door is something we've chosen not to face, the apology we never made, the failure we never admitted, the grief we never named. We walk past these doors day after day, convincing ourselves the silence inside them keeps us safe. But silence does not keep what's behind the door contained. It amplifies it, each passing year. The knock grows louder. Each ignored sound becomes a pounding. And eventually, when the door bursts open, it does not release what we feared, it releases what silence has made of it. This is why some fathers become monsters, not because they were born evil, but because silence turned their unspoken truths into beasts too large to contain. Jack Torrance walked those corridors. He ignored those doors, and when they finally opened, what came out was no longer guilt, no longer regret. It was rage. Silence had devoured everything else, in one sense. He is terrifying because he is so familiar. Who hasn't felt the pressure of swallowed words, of anger pressed down until it burns like acid in the gut? Who hasn't looked at someone they love and felt the weight of everything left unsaid? The fear that speaking would destroy more than silence ever could? But that is the paradox. Silence feels safer in the moment, but it destroys more in the end. Words may wound, but silence builds monsters that wound without end. Wendy's courage shines because it is not born of strength, but necessity. She is not a warrior. She is not a fighter. She is a woman who has lived with silence for so long that when it finally breaks, she chooses survival over submission. Her weapon is not power, but refusal. She will not let silence take her son. She will not let it claim her. She may tremble. She may scream. She may cry, but she fights. And in that fight, she shows us the other path. If silence devours, then voice, any voice, becomes salvation. It may be messy, it may be desperate, but it is enough to keep the monster from finishing its feast. We must consider what silence costs children most of all. For Danny, the lesson is seared into him. The man he loves most can become the man he fears most. That is the devastating alchemy of silence. It distorts love until it becomes indistinguishable from terror. It teaches children that affection can vanish, that safety can turn on them, that the walls of home are not always protection, but prison. And once a child learns that, it never leaves them. They carry it into adulthood, into relationships, into their own parenthood. Silence breeds silence. Trauma breeds trauma, unless someone, somewhere, dares to break the cycle. Danny survived. But survival is not healing. Healing requires breaking silence, not just escaping it. The Overlook is often described as alive, as if it were a creature feeding on those trapped within. But perhaps it is nothing more than silence made manifest, a building stuffed with the echoes of the unspoken, the undone, the unhealed. It traps because silence always traps. It whispers because silence always whispers. It possesses because silence always takes possession of the soul. And the more Jack listened, the more silence spoke for him. He thought he was hearing the hotel, but he was only hearing his own suppressed voice, magnified, twisted, amplified by years of silence. That is why he could not resist it, because the voice of silence was his own. And here lies the terrifying truth. Every one of us carries an overlook inside. Every one of us knows what silence has cost. Maybe not in blood, maybe not in violence, but in love withheld, in connections lost, in nights where words could have mended, but silence widened the gap. How many relationships end not because of cruelty, but because silence became unbearable? How many families fracture not because of betrayal, but because no one spoke? How many lives unravel not from catastrophe, but from quiet, relentless, consuming silence? This is what King forces us to confront, that the real monster is not in the dark corners of the hotel, but in the dark corners of ourselves. So, we return to the beginning. Why do some fathers become monsters? Because silence teaches them that to speak is weakness. Because pride convinces them silence is strength. Because society applauds the silent man. but does not comfort the broken one. Because silence feels easier than confession, and because once silence devours long enough, it leaves nothing left to resist the monster waiting in the shadows. Jack Torrance is a warning etched in horror, but the lesson is human. Silence destroys. It destroys fathers. It destroys families. It destroys love. And now, the question lingers like the frost in the maze. In your life, are you speaking, or are you letting silence do the speaking for you? What makes The Shining endure is not only the blood or the haunted corridors, but the way it forces us to confront the quiet horror of ourselves. Strip away the hotel, the ghosts, the supernatural trappings, and what remains is a portrait of a man undone by his refusal to speak. Jack Torrance is not a phantom. He is us when we choose silence over truth, pride over vulnerability, denial over confession. And in this, King does not simply tell a ghost story. He tells a human story, one that exposes the cracks in our foundations and dares us to look down into the abyss beneath. The abyss is not glamorous. It is not even dramatic. It is the father who cannot say "I love you" without choking on the words. It is the husband who apologizes with silence, thinking his absence of anger is enough. It is the man who chooses to drink, to disappear, to retreat, because silence feels less shameful than honesty. But shame thrives in silence. That is the journey of too many men we know, and perhaps, if we are honest, it is a journey some of us fear for ourselves. But what if the silence had been broken earlier? What if Jack had opened the door, admitted his fears, confessed his guilt? What if he had told Danny, "I am sorry," and let the boy see not a monster, but a father struggling to become better? What if he had let Wendy into the places he guarded so fiercely? Perhaps the hotel would still have whispered. Perhaps the darkness would still have crept in. But the silence would not have been fertile ground for it to root. Words could have been weapons. Words could have been shields. Words could have been the rope that pulled him back from the abyss. That is the tragedy. We will never know. Silence made sure of that. The psychology of silence is cruel in its simplicity. It convinces us we are safer without words, but it ensures we are destroyed by their absence. It feeds on pride, on fear of rejection, on the illusion of control, and it thrives in families because love makes silence easier to excuse. A child excuses a father's silence because they crave his affection. A wife excuses her husband's silence because she remembers the man he once was. And so silence persists, wrapped in the fragile hope that tomorrow he will speak. Tomorrow he will change. But silence has no intention of changing. It only grows. What breaks the cycle is not hope. It is confrontation. To break silence is to force it into the light, to speak the words that burn, to name the truth that frightens. It is messy. It is painful. It risks rejection, conflict, collapse, but it also risks redemption. And without that risk, silence guarantees only one outcome: devouring. We see this in Wendy's fight, in Danny's shining, in Halloran's return. They choose voice, they choose action, they choose to shatter the silence, even if it means screaming, even if it means running, even if it means fighting with every ounce of strength left. They refuse to be consumed, and that refusal saves them. Still, we cannot escape the shadow of the father who does not speak. Jack's face frozen in the maze is not only an image of death, it is an image of silence made permanent. He is trapped forever in his refusal, his words forever unsaid, his redemption forever denied. That is the fate of those who let silence devour them completely. And though we may shiver at the sight, the real shiver should come from recognizing how close any of us could be to that fate. Not with an axe in hand, not in a snowbound maze, but in the quiet death of a relationship, the cold freeze of a family that no longer speaks, the empty stare of a man who cannot say what he feels. And so, the final question is not about Jack Torrance, it is about us. What silence have we allowed to grow too strong? What words have we locked behind doors, believing they are safer hidden? What children? What partners? What loved ones are waiting in the dark for us to break the silence? And if we do not, what monsters will our silence create? Because in the end, the silence that devours does not stop with one man, one father, one family. It spreads, it echoes, it infects, until someone dares to speak.